Hard modes are utterly fascinating to me. Honestly, you could extend that out to include a general appreciation of every time a game has to alter bits and pieces to make itself more challenging, and sometimes doesn't always get everything all nice and perfect like. I live for these quirky hard modes where natural game balance has been thrown out of the nearest window in favour for something considerably more nutty. Does it count as false advertising if a hard mode isn't actually all that hard? Good luck in that lawsuit, I'm sure everything will work out just fine. This is all relative, of course, but I do have a certain soft spot for hard modes that aren't actually all that hard. A lot of that will come down to what game you're playing at the time, since quite a lot of them won't have various different difficulty settings, but others will have a whole bunch of incremental difficulty modes, so there's no one and done rule for them all, but I do love some hard modes. I've never really been one for handouts, and the idea of any game rolling out the red carpet just to stroke my enormous ego is not all that appealing to me. Don't get me wrong, there's a time and place for easier games and the more zen style of relaxing gaming, but I can't lie to you. Any and every time I play a game and choose hard mode and it slowly dawns on me that developers and I have different ideas on what hard looks like, I can't hide my disappointment at that. Are you kidding me? I'm not going to pretend that I'm some epic pro gamer who has to flex his bulging gamer muscles in order to feel something in my tremendously empty life, but I like my horror games scary and my hard modes hard. I have very simple needs. The easiest way of making a game more difficult is to make enemies do more damage to you, obviously, since tweaking those numbers is likely to have a big effect on the challenge that a player can face. But also, if tweaking those numbers also affect the amount of damage that the player does, you're going to create an incredible domino effect that might make things a little messy. Which is another way of saying that any game with a counter mechanic can very quickly lose all semblance of balancing if the game's difficulty is upscaled for a hard mode. If the counter move does fixed damage, you're probably going to be alright, but if it calculates damage dealt by how much the enemy would have done to you, increasing that number for a hard mode also makes it so that you do more damage as well. And I've played Devil May Cry games with Heaven or Hell enabled so that you one-shot everything but die in one shot as well as a way of balance, but I don't get the sense that Metal Gear Rising was designed with this type of gameplay in mind. This is the same game that inexplicably lets you be stealthy and also graphically chop enemies into thin strips of flesh. So it's nice they thought of everything. Countering is a very important component of Metal Gear Rising, despite it not really being a game mechanic that is presented front and center. I mean, you can definitely beat the game without knowing how to parry enemy attacks, since that's what I did, but I wouldn't recommend it because it makes this stupid boss fight really hard, and I got so mad, and it's actually really easy, but I didn't know, and just fuck this fucking shit. The window in which you have to press the right button to parry an enemy attack is a little small, but once you get it down, this game is a piece of cake. And that's the problem. Revengeance difficulty makes every enemy do a ton of damage to Raiden, which would be a really big issue if it weren't for one game mechanic that takes all the damage the enemies are throwing at you and turns it against them. Basically, you get the timing on the parries down, and this is a walk in the park, which I feel is appropriate considering how uber confident Raiden is for most of this game, and Revengeance difficulty does feel very satisfying to play through even though it is very easy. It's probably one of the few easy hard modes that I enjoy thinking about it now. That does not bode well for the rest of this shit, does it? First-person shooters make for some incredibly polarizing experiences with their hard modes. Depending on which decade you find yourself in, you can very easily end up playing a shooter with a fun and rewarding hard mode that makes you feel like God's gift to video games, or potentially something significantly more difficult that forces you back into your shell as you're forced to rethink the foundations on which your self-esteem is built on. When Bioshock Infinite came out, a lot was made of its 1999 mode, which was designed to evoke the feeling of playing a classic FPS game, and its unrelenting difficulty curve that leaves you on the floor in a puddle of blood picking up your own teeth. It does tie into this idea of developers overselling how hard their game is, which Irrational Games played into very well when they described 1999 mode as not feeling like Bioshock Infinite. That's always a good sign. The initial feeling on this thing was that the limited available resources and having to spend in-game cash to respawn was enough to make 1999 mode a real slog and a constant struggle to find enjoyment in this surprisingly counterintuitive game mode. Definitely in theory this should give you a lot to worry about, since you do die pretty quickly once your shield is depleted and you literally can't afford to do that too often, but therein lies the biggest stumbling block with 1999 mode: once your shield is depleted. If you pump all your upgrades into making your shield more robust, there's very little that this game can throw at you that you can't handle with just a bit of patience on your side. If you take damage, you can just sit tight for a minute, let it recharge, and continue on your merry way. And if you're playing through 1999 mode having already beaten Bioshock Infinite, there's very little in here that will surprise you. Some hard modes are able to extract extra difficulty out of familiar settings, but 1999 is a bit bland in this regard, and once you know what you need to do, it's very easy to do that and beat it without too much trouble. By the way, 1999 refers to the year System Shock 2 came out, one of Irrational's previous games, and it's honestly about as hard as this extra hard mode for Bioshock Infinite. If that isn't a sign of how cushy games have gotten over the years, I don't know what to tell you. Other than to go play Battletoads and come back to me about needing difficulty settings. That experience will tell you all you need to know about life. I think it's safe to say that not every game needs separate difficulty modes. Sometimes it can be more hassle than it's worth to make every tiny part of a game more difficult, especially if the very makeup of the game renders this a losing proposition. It's not impossible to make an RPG more challenging with the addition of a hard mode, but it is a lot less interesting than you might think. This is why most RPGs hide away a hidden boss in the post-game, so that more ambitious players have something to work towards, because, let's face it, a hard mode in an RPG is probably gonna just raise every enemy's levels by a bit and leave it at that. Pokemon has its fair share of super bosses and optional legendary Pokemon to keep the overachievers occupied after they've conquered the world and achieved world peace, but Pokemon Black 2 and White 2 broke the mold by including an actual bona fide hard mode. And an easy mode, mind you. Could have used that second one nowadays, might get those NPCs to shut up about all their stupid tutorials. Most hard modes require you to beat the game once before unlocking them, which then provides the player with a very exciting incentive to replay the game again, but with an added challenge, and this is really good replay value. If you stack this on top of Pokemon, which through the fact that it's got so much variety to the roster of Pokemon you can choose from, that's an unbelievable amount of replay value. If only the games had more than one save file. Not to get off topic, but the fact that mainline Pokemon games still come with one save slot is very irritating. It actually ties into the fundamental problem with Pokemon Black and White 2's challenge mode, since you need to beat the champion in order to obtain a harder run through of the game. And after dozens of hours of bonding with your imperious team of critters, do you honestly think that I'd overwrite the only save file they've given me to do it all again, but with some slightly stronger opponents? Of course not, but obviously that's not really why we're here. Luckily, it's not like taking challenge mode in a vacuum suddenly redeems it of all its many faults, since it's not like adding a few more levels onto all the trainer battles makes a damn bit of difference. A large part of what makes a Pokemon game challenging is not necessarily knowing what's coming next and having to constantly shuffle around your balanced team in order to fight off the next big threat. If you already know what's coming, it'll make for a bigger difference in difficulty than any small increase in level ever could. Not to mention that higher trainer levels yield more experience points for your Pokemon, so you'll end up at roughly the same level as them in no time anyway. Small wonder then why there's never been another mainline Pokemon game with difficulty settings. Just throw me more of those super bosses in Sword and Shield, I just want to see Cynthia's Garchomp make me cry again. I don't think it's too much to ask for a game's hard mode to have a noticeable difference on the game I'm playing. You know, I'm all for mysterious forces working in the background to make a game more exciting, but I would like to know what enabling hard mode actually does for me. Because if I start dying more often, I'd like to know why. And the relevancy of that in today's video is that not being able to notice how a game is more challenging is perhaps a sign that a hard mode isn't exactly pulling its weight. I'm not saying I need a ticker tape parade and to be beaten over the head every 5 seconds as a means of reminding me that I enabled hard mode a little while back, but if a game can organically display what this change in difficulty means for me, then that would be very helpful, thank you. The Binding of Issac has been through many iterations and has benefited from numerous expansions and DLC releases in the past, but it was the upgrade to Rebirth that saw the addition of an extra difficulty setting in the game. Now you can enable hard mode before taking off on your perilous journey into your mum's womb and beyond. Listen, this is probably going to be hard enough to stomach as is. Do you reckon hard mode adds even more vaginas that vomit blood or something? I kinda wish it did, because at least then I'd be able to notice that it had some kind of effect on the game I'm playing right now. Instead, hard mode increases the spawn rate of slightly stronger variants of enemies and decreases the number of hearts that drop after defeating them. But overall, it's a bunch of small changes that don't amount to much. Even more damning is the fact that the Binding of Issac is a roguelike, where every run has a huge amount of natural variance, lessening the need for a little setting to be enabled before starting it. If the run is a hard one, that'll be because the right items didn't drop for you and the game is kicking your butt. Similarly, if the run is easy, it's probably because you got some really strong items and or synergies, and now you're on a straight path to the end. My point is that hard mode makes virtually no difference in a game where 1,000,001 things have a bigger impact on your enjoyment, and since you unlock items for beating the game with hard mode enabled, there's absolutely no reason why you wouldn't use hard mode all the time. But just in case things get too random and too difficult, you can always subscribe to a channel that reliably uploads easy to watch content and click the bell for notifications of every time he uploads more of it. Northern Lion. He's been making Issac videos for years and has done thousands of runs in that time. This game must be super easy then. A hard mode that is too easy isn't automatically a bad thing. I mean, it often is, because you'll usually select a harder difficulty with a few expectations as to what to expect, namely, it being harder than the standard difficulty. Hey, sometimes life is just like that. One minute you're being disappointed in the game lowballing its hard mode at you, and then the next you're finishing off a video script as you find out the game theory shouted you out and said you make good videos. It do be like that sometimes, and I appreciate the love, Matt. I've played a number of games in the past where the hard mode stands as the recommended way of playing it if you want some kind of reasonable challenge. I suppose this ties into the idea of some games not really needing a hard mode, since if hard feels like normal, then what the fuck is normal even doing here in the first place? It can be frustrating to see this play out in front of you, but it can be even more frustrating having to wait for a 3D Sonic game that isn't disappointing and a waste of everyone's time. I'll be an old man when that day comes. I feel like I'm part of a small minority when I say that Sonic Forces is honest to God one of the worst games I've played in recent years. It might not be as technically lacking as something like Sonic Boom, but Forces is so devoid of enjoyment and creativity that I felt bored as all hell throughout the 3 hours it took to beat this game. Going into it, I already knew that it was quite short, so my hope was that it would take me a bit longer since I selected hard mode from the start, since I've played a Sonic game before and that's all the experience I need apparently. So you can imagine my surprise when I got into the meat of the game and noticed how incredibly easy Sonic Forces is. The only problems I ran into were the result of some dodgy platforming physics that would have been present regardless of difficulty, so what's the difference and why should I care? The only change of any note is that you lose 20 rings at a time in normal instead of losing everything on contact in hard. The latter of which you may recognise as the standard way of playing a Sonic game, because that's been the case for decades now and can't really be considered the hard mode, but fuck it, I guess it is now! Here I am looking for some extra challenge to this underwhelmingly short Sonic game that might go some way towards helping me feel some kind of emotion playing this beyond— Dude! My OC looks very unwell. But all hard mode in Sonic Forces does is assure me that Sega still don't know how to get the best out of Sonic and are a long way off of getting close to getting the most out of their biggest franchise again. No, you've read too much into this. This is RabbidLuigi, and this reminds me of when I was talking about Pokemon earlier and saying that some games don't really need a hard mode, and all I can think now is, what would a Sonic game look like with a hard mode attached to it that is satisfying and enjoyable to play? Like, would you add more enemies? You can't really make Sonic take more damage, maybe you can have less checkpoints or something, or maybe you can just make it that Sonic goes through the level faster on hard mode. I want to play a Sonic game as the fabric of reality is being distorted around me. Though that may naturally happen whenever Sega decide to make a good one again. Have you got a topic that you'd like me to talk about next week? Make sure you leave a comment about that down below because I'll be taking the most interesting suggestions and making a poll on the next video. In fact, here's one right now that I prepared from last week. I'll be revealing the winner of the poll on Twitter and taking suggestions for games to talk about that are related to that topic. So feel free to follow me over there so we can keep in touch. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.